Okay, so this is on section 3 of the handout, which is called Categories in Grammar. And so what we've talked about so far is how speech sounds get made a little tiny bit, and the idea that we eventually hear them, and what we hear consists of some minimal units that I'm calling segments, and that these segments look like letters, but they're not letters, and you don't have to write in order to know the sound system of a language in order to have segments. Right? So one of the, now we're into the more sort of linguistic-y grammatical section of the class. So we're going to take about a month to learn some basics of phonetics, and then we're going to get on into the more abstract part of the class, and that's where this starts. Right? So one central question in all of linguistics, not just in phonology, what in language is universal across languages, and which things are language specific? That is, which things vary between languages. That's an important question because, well, first of all, we're trying to describe languages, so you want to know what they all have in common versus things that they don't. Right? It's also important because it informs the theory of how humans learn or acquire languages, and in some broader sense, how are people's minds structured such that they learn languages that always look like this but don't always look like that, or maybe languages that never do this thing. Right? That's what a lot of linguistics is about. Now, the universal stuff explaining that ends up being super complicated and controversial, and we'll talk about that a bit late in the semester, about universals, but let's leave that aside for now. Language-specific properties have a much simpler and not controversial at all explanation. Right? If something is specific to some language, or if it varies between languages, we use these to basically say the same thing, it has to be learned by infants, or presumably by older speakers who are acquiring the language, but certainly by infants who have no language yet. Right? How do we know that? Well, as far as we can tell, all human infants are born ready to learn any human language. You take any infant born anywhere in the world and put them in any other culture anywhere else, and they're going to grow up speaking the language that's being spoken around them in that culture. Humans appear to be mostly biologically equivalent when it comes to language. Whatever allows you to learn English is the exact same thing that allows you to learn Mandarin if you happen to be born in Beijing, that allows you to learn modern standard Arabic if you happen to be born in a place where that's spoken, or that allows you to learn Murcian Spanish if that's where you're born. Right? It doesn't matter where a baby is born or what their genes are like, they will always acquire the language that's around them, that's being spoken around them when they're infants. Right? Therefore, if there's things that differ in different languages, those can't be things that the children were born with. That has to be something that they learn by the time they're young children. So if Mandarin uses high or low pitch to mark the difference between words, but English doesn't, right? At some point, infants being raised around Mandarin speakers are going to have to learn that that's part of a word meaning, and infants being raised around English speakers are going to have to learn not, or to learn to ignore that or something like that, because as far as we know, English and Chinese babies are born exactly the same biologically with respect to language, so if there's things that differ between those languages, they're things that have to be learned. Anything that's being learned by infants that they're representing and storing in their minds is part of the job of linguistics to describe any of that acquired stuff. So that's why we're interested in things that vary between languages. So what are some things that differ from language to language? Well, actually pause the video for a second and just come up with a list of, don't think too hard. It shouldn't be very hard to come up with a few things. Just think of some things that differ from languages to languages. Everybody in this class, I think, speaks a foreign language, so let's work on that for a sec. Okay, so hopefully you've come up with a long list of things that differ between languages. There's a lot of things can be extremely different between different languages. Right? Here's maybe the most obvious one. I think this might be the most obvious answer to the question out of all the possible obvious answers: words. Words are different in different languages. Like the word for floor is different in English than it is in Spanish, Mandarin, Arabic, French, or Italian, right? They're going to be different in each of these languages. And actually, when I say words here, and for most of this handout, I'm actually talking about morphemes. For those of you who know what a morpheme is, it's the minimal unit of meaning in a language, of meaningful memorized material that is sometimes a word, but is sometimes a little bit smaller than a word, right? So it includes things like prefixes and suffixes and so on and so forth. Right? So because words and morphemes are different in every language, obviously somebody acquiring a language has to learn the words and the morphemes of that language. So let's talk a little bit about morphemes, because this is going to be a basic unit in phonology. Morphemes in linguistics are generally treated as arbitrary pairings of sounds and meanings. What does that mean? Well, the key word here is arbitrary. So you learn as an English learning infant the word book. And the point here is that there's no rule of English such that objects made out of paper have to start with the sound ba. Right? There's no rule for getting from the sequence of sounds ba, k to the physical object. Oh, this is embarrassing. I have a Dan Brown book in my extra room. I don't even know how this got in here. It's not mine, but that's a book. Anyhow, yeah, there's no principle of English according to which you could predict the way that this object needs to sound, right? Or that you could predict from the sequence of sounds, book, that it has to mean something like this object. There is no such system. It's arbitrary in the sense that these sounds, ba-uk, right? These do not resemble or imply or predict the object, a book, in some way, right? There's no system of rules you get here. English speakers use that word to refer to that object because they happen to have been raised in a culture where people were using those sounds, book, to refer to that object. And the same is true for all the other languages spoken in this class. There's nothing about the sequence of sounds, kitab, that means it has to be a book. You just happen to have learned that sequence of sounds because that's what Arabic speakers happen to have been using to refer to it. Similarly, libro is not a systematically sound symbolic representation of a book. Neither is livre, that's the French one. And none of these words more generally in anybody's language in this class is going to resemble the object book in some ways. And this is sometimes illustrated in Intro to Linguistics classes by showing you the exception that sort of proves the rule, because every once in a while you do get a word that resembles the thing it means. For instance, vroom is a sound that a car can make, where clearly here that sequence of sounds vroom is meant to represent the actual sound that a car makes. That's an onomatopoeia, and the point of that is just that the vast majority of all words in all languages are not onomatopoeic. Right? They're arbitrary. That's what we mean by arbitrary. What that means is that the relationship between the sequence of sounds, in this case ba-u-k, and the object, paper thing with symbols written on it, that's something that is unpredictable. It's not something you could use general principles to predict or learn, so you just have to memorize it. As you learn English, whether you're a child or an adult when you're learning it, you just memorize the fact that that object has the string of sounds book associated with it. So minimally, people are going to need to keep word or morpheme definitions in their memory, their long-term memory that they can access at any time in order to speak a language. And we refer to that long-term memory system where you keep morphemes stored with their sounds and their meanings. We refer to that as the lexicon in linguistics. So exactly what the lexicon looks like, what's in there, where it exists in your brain, any of this stuff is going to be kind of complicated and subject to disagreement. Different linguists will tell you different things about how the lexicon works, but at a bare minimum, everybody pretty much agrees you have to have paired sounds and meanings for each morpheme in your language stored in your lexicon. Otherwise, there'd be no way to produce the words and the morphemes of your language. So that's sort of the minimal conditions on a lexical item. On something in the lexicon, it has an arbitrary pairing of sounds and meaning, where the meaning is something like the object itself, you know, to sort of simplify a bit, and the sounds are something like b, k,